My husband made me a cup of coffee that had a very strange, pungent smell. "I made you a special coffee, darling," he said. I replied, "How sweet," and quietly switched cups with my sister-in-law, who had always harassed me. 30 minutes later, "Don't you want to try the coffee I made especially for you, darling?" my husband James asked me with a strange smile that didn't reach his eyes. I was sitting at the elegant dining table of my sister-in-law, Nina, at her Nashville home where we gathered for our monthly family brunch. The cup of coffee in front of me had a strange, almost metallic smell that churned my stomach. My name is Christina, and at 29, I never imagined I'd question whether my own husband was trying to poison me. But after 3 years of marriage and countless instances of accidental food poisoning, I'd learned to be cautious. Especially with Nina. She had a way of orchestrating situations that left me sick or humiliated, always with that same innocent smile that James was sporting now. "How thoughtful of you," I replied, forcing a smile as my mind raced. The aroma emanating from the cup was unlike any coffee I'd ever smelled. It reminded me of last month when I ended up in the ER after a meal at Nina's. The doctors couldn't explain my symptoms, and Nina had insisted she'd prepared the tea exactly the same way she made hers. Nina watched me intently from across the table, pointedly stirring her untouched coffee. "James has become quite the barista lately," she said with a smirk. "He's been practicing different brewing methods just for you." The way she emphasized "for you" sent a shiver down my spine. I had noticed James spending more time at Nina's house lately, claiming they were planning a surprise for our upcoming anniversary. But something felt off. The whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room, the strange texts I'd glimpsed on his phone, and now this coffee, with its peculiar aroma. I lifted the cup and pretended to take a sip, studying their expressions. James and Nina exchanged a quick glance that confirmed my suspicions. I stood up abruptly, feigning interest in my phone. "Oh, would you look at that? I need to make a quick work call. Nina, would you mind if I used your study table?" As I passed Nina's chair, I stumbled deliberately and swiftly switched our coffee cups. In the confusion of righting myself, I exclaimed, "I'm so sorry. I'm so clumsy sometimes." Nina dismissed my apology with a tight smile. "Just try not to break anything in the study." I nodded and hurried away, my heart pounding, through the study door. I could still see them sitting at the table. Now, all I had to do was wait and watch. From the study doorway, I watched Nina raise the coffee cup to her lips, and my stomach clenched with anxiety. A part of me wanted to stop her, to warn her, but I needed to know the truth. There had been too many nights in emergency rooms, too many hours doubled over in pain, always after sharing meals with them. It hadn't always been this way. When I met James at a friend's wedding in Asheville 3 years ago, he was charming and attentive. Nina, too, seemed welcoming, inviting me to family gatherings and offering to help plan our wedding. But looking back, I should have noticed the red flags. The way she'd accidentally spill things on my dress at important events, or how my food always seemed to have extra seasoning when she helped cook. The incident started small, an upset stomach here, a mild allergic reaction there. James always had an excuse ready. Maybe it was something I'd eaten earlier, or I was coming down with something. But the pattern was becoming clearer. The worst was 2 months ago when I ended up hospitalized after breakfast at their house. Doctors found traces of something in my system they couldn't identify, but James convinced everyone I must have taken some expired medication. I gripped the doorframe, watching as Nina took another sip of the coffee. James was typing on his phone, seemingly unconcerned. My untouched cup sat cold on the table where I'd left it, the metallic smell still lingering in the air, making me shudder. A slight tremor in Nina's hand caught my attention. She set the cup down, her face pale. Suddenly, her voice trembled. "Something's wrong, James." James looked up, his expression shifting from confusion to horror as he realized which cup she was drinking. He jumped up, knocking over his chair. "Nina, what's happening?" Nina's hands were shaking violently now. "I don't feel." She tried to stand but stumbled, gripping the edge of the table for support. "James, what did you put in that coffee?" I stepped out of the study, my phone already recording. James was at Nina's side now, his face ashen. "That wasn't your cup," he whispered, but in the silence of the dining room, his words were heard with chilling clarity. Nina's eyes widened, shocked and frightened. "Call an ambulance," she gasped, sliding to the floor. "Please, I can't." I dialed 911 immediately, my hands steady despite the chaos unfolding before me. Nina was on the floor now, her body racked by violent tremors. James knelt beside her, panic etched on his face, as the realization that his plan had backfired spectacularly dawned on him. "Emergency services, yes, we need an ambulance at 1542 Maple Grove Drive," I said clearly, keeping my phone recording with my other hand. "It appears my sister-in-law is having a severe reaction to something in her coffee. She's conscious, but experiencing tremors." As I spoke to the operator, Nina's eyes locked on mine. The usual cold calculation in her gaze was replaced by pure fear. "Christina, you switched." "I already know, ma'am," the operator assured me. "The ambulance is on its way. Please stay on the line." James was growing more frantic by the second. "Nina, what's happening? That wasn't supposed. I mean, it wasn't meant." "Shut up, James," Nina hissed, her anger momentarily overriding her distress. "This is all your fault. You said it would just make her sick enough to miss the board meeting next week. You promised me it wouldn't be traceable." My blood ran cold. The board meeting, where I was scheduled to present my proposal for a major client account. The same account Nina had been trying to secure for months at our competing firms. It all started to click into place. "The tea last month," I said, my voice surprisingly firm, "and the breakfast incident 2 months ago. Those weren't accidents, were they?" Nina's face contorted with another wave of pain. "The tea that was supposed to keep you home during the Johnson contract presentation. But you went anyway." She clutched her stomach, doubling over. "James said we just needed to discredit you, make the clients think you're unreliable." The sound of sirens filled the air outside. James stood up and backed away from both of us. "Nina, stop talking. You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying." Nina spat, her words slightly slurred. "We've been planning this for months, ever since Christina started outperforming me at every client meeting. You were supposed to make sure she drank it today." Paramedics burst through the front door, and I quickly stepped aside to let them work. As they lifted Nina onto a gurney, I stopped recording and sent the video to my private email, and then to my lawyer. James stood frozen, watching us, his carefully crafted plan crumbling around him. "I'll accompany her to the hospital," I told the paramedics, my voice steady. "After all, I need to make sure my sister-in-law receives proper treatment." I met James's terrified gaze. "And I'm sure the doctors will be very interested to know exactly what was in that coffee." The ER at Nashville General Hospital was a whirlwind of activity as doctors rushed to treat Nina. I sat in the waiting area, phone in hand, replaying the recording of Nina's confession. The tremors in her voice, the panic in her eyes, it was all the proof I needed to show this wasn't just paranoia on my part. "Family of Nina Anderson?" a nurse called. I stood up, noticing the conspicuous absence of James. He'd muttered something about parking the car 20 minutes ago and hadn't returned. "I'm her sister-in-law," I said, following the nurse through the double doors. "How is she?" "She's stabilized, but we've found concerning levels of toxins in her system." The nurse's expression was grave. "The doctor would like to speak with you about some unusual findings in her blood work." Dr. Phillips, a tall woman with graying hair and a piercing gaze, was waiting outside Nina's room. "Mrs. Bennett, could you tell me exactly what happened before your sister-in-law became ill?" I took a deep breath and pulled out my phone. "I think you should listen to this first." I played the recording of the lunch, watching as Dr. Phillips's expression shifted from professional concern to alarm. "This is very serious," she said, making notes on her tablet. "The substance we found isn't something that ends up in coffee accidentally. We're dealing with deliberate contamination." Just then, James appeared at the end of the hallway, his face pale and sweating. He'd clearly overheard the doctor's words. "Christina," he started, taking a step towards me. "Let me explain. Don't come any closer," Dr. Phillips warned, pressing a nurse call button. "Security to room 412, please." James raised his hands in surrender. This is all a misunderstanding. Nina was confused. She didn't know what she was saying. Really? I pulled up the text message I'd discovered on his phone last week, the ones I'd secretly forwarded to myself. So those messages between you and Nina about making sure she's out of commission before the Henderson presentation were just friendly conversation? His face paled. You went through my phone? After I found the strange pills in your desk drawer? Yes, I did. I addressed Dr. Phillips. I've been hospitalized 3 times in the past 6 months with unexplained symptoms. I'd like to know if they match what you found in Nina's system today. The doctor's eyes narrowed. We'll need to run some tests to compare. Security will make sure your husband is available for questioning. 2 security guards appeared and positioned themselves on either side of James. He looked trapped, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. Nina and I, he stammered. We were just trying to help you slow down. You were working too hard, taking on all the major clients. Nina said if we could just get you to take some time off. By poisoning me? My voice was steady even as my hands trembled with rage. How long have you been doing this? Were you the one tampering with my food at the Christmas party, too? James's silence was all the answer I needed. Behind him, I could see Nina watching through the window of her hospital room. Her earlier bravado was gone, replaced by the fear of someone who knew their schemes had finally caught up with them. Detective Mendoza is on her way, Dr. Phillips said quietly. She'll want to take statements from everyone involved. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm. The truth was finally coming out, and there was no going back. Detective Mendoza arrived in less than an hour, her presence commanding attention in the sterile hospital hallway. She was a seasoned investigator who specialized in domestic abuse cases, and she listened intently as I played the lunch recording and showed her the text messages. Mrs. Bennett, she said, reviewing her notes. You mentioned previous hospitalizations. Can you tell me more about those incidents? I pulled out my phone again and opened a document I'd been quietly keeping for months. The first time was in February, after a dinner at Nina's. I had severe stomach pains and dizziness. The second was in April, the tea incident. Then in June, after breakfast with them. I kept my voice even as I continued. Each time, the symptoms were similar but just different enough that doctors couldn't pinpoint a cause. The detective's eyes narrowed as she looked at my detailed log of dates, symptoms, and circumstances. And you've been keeping records since? Since I noticed the pattern. I hesitated before pulling another phone from my purse. I also started carrying a spare phone with a different number. I used it to record conversations when I was around them. I have several where Nina and James discuss their plans, though they're careful not to be explicit. In one of the recordings, Nina's voice was clearly audible. The Henderson account is worth millions, James. We can't let her ruin everything we've worked for. We just need to stick to the plan. A few days of illness should be enough. James's reply was equally damning. This time, I have something stronger. She won't make it to the presentation. Detective Mendoza's expression hardened as she listened. Through the window of Nina's room, I could see my sister-in-law was awake now, looking far less confident than she had at lunch. The hospital is running toxicology tests, the detective informed me. Dr. Phillips has already identified several substances that don't exist in nature. We'll also need samples from your homes and offices. A commotion down the hall caught our attention. James was arguing with the security guards, his voice rising with desperation. I need to talk to my wife, he shouted. Christina, please. You don't understand. We were trying to protect you. Detective Mendoza stepped between us. Mr. Bennett, you're not helping your case. We already have evidence of premeditation. Premeditation? James laughed, a hollow sound that echoed down the hallway. We were just trying to slow her down. She was working herself to death, taking on all the important accounts. Nina said if we could just get her to take some time off. By poisoning her? Detective Mendoza's voice was sharp. That's not protection, Mr. Bennett. That's attempted murder. The color drained from James's face. Murder? We never intended. Then what exactly did you intend? I asked, my voice surprisingly calm. When you put something in my coffee this morning, what was supposed to happen? James's silence spoke volumes. Behind him, I could see Nina watching through her hospital room window, her face a mask of fear and calculation. I wondered if she was trying to figure out how to spin this, how to justify months of systematic poisoning as some kind of misguided attempt to help me. "We'll need both of your phones," Detective Mendoza said to the security guards. "And I want officers posted at both doors. No one leaves until we have those toxicology results." Dr. Phillips entered Nina's room, a tablet in hand, her expression grim as she reviewed the test results. Detective Mendoza and I followed, while James remained outside with the guards. Nina tried to sit up straighter in her hospital bed, but the tremors hadn't completely subsided. "The toxicology report shows elevated levels of several substances," Dr. Phillips announced, her voice clinical. "Most concerning is the presence of a particular compound typically used in pharmaceutical trials. It's not something the general public should have access to." Nina's face paled. "That's impossible." James said it was something that would only cause mild symptoms. "Mild symptoms," Detective Mendoza interrupted, pulling out her notebook. "Like the ones your sister-in-law experienced over the past 6 months?" The door opened, and another detective entered, holding an evidence bag. "Found these in Mr. Bennett's office desk at the Anderson marketing firm," he informed me, presenting several small vials with clinical labels, along with detailed notes on dosages and reactions. I felt my knees weaken as the full scope of their plan hit me. "You were documenting everything like some kind of experiment, weren't you?" Nina protested, but her voice wavered. "We just needed to keep track of what was working. The first few attempts weren't effective enough. She kept going to the meetings anyway, so you increased the dosages," Detective Mendoza concluded, examining the vials. "You knew these substances could be lethal in higher concentrations." The room fell silent. James, who was still visible through the window, slumped into a chair in the hallway, his hands covering his face. "The Henderson account," I said slowly, the pieces clicking into place. "It wasn't just about that presentation, was it? You needed me out of the way permanently because the client specifically requested me as their lead." Nina's face twisted with a mixture of anger and fear. "You were ruining everything. I built that client portfolio for years, and then you show up and suddenly everyone wants to work with you." James said he could fix it by killing me. The words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. "We weren't trying to," Nina began, but Dr. Phillips cut her off. "The concentration in the coffee she drank today," the doctor stated, looking directly at Nina, "was significantly higher than the previous traces we've analyzed from Mrs. Bennett's previous hospital visits. If she had consumed it, the outcome would have been severe, possibly fatal." Detective Mendoza turned to the other officer. "We'll need a full warrant for their homes and offices and contact the pharmaceutical company listed on these vials. Find out how they obtained these substances." Nina sank back against the pillows, the fight seemingly draining out of her. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she whispered. "James kept saying we just needed one more try." I approached her bed, my voice firm despite the tremor in my hands. "Every time I got sick, every meeting I missed, every client I lost, both of you were there watching, taking notes on how your poison was affecting me. What kind of people does that turn you into?" The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, I could hear James being read his rights as more officers arrived. Nina stared at her hands, unable to meet my eyes. "Detective," I said, turning my back on my sister-in-law, "I'm ready to give my formal statement now." The trial lasted 3 weeks, but it felt like years. I sat in the courtroom every day, watching as the prosecution methodically laid out their case against James and Nina. The evidence was overwhelming. The vials from James's office, his detailed notes on each poisoning attempt, the recorded conversations, and the text messages where they discussed their plans. What struck me most was their demeanor throughout the proceedings. Nina, normally so poised and self-assured, looked small in the defendant's chair. James couldn't even look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor as expert witnesses detailed the potentially lethal effects of the substances they'd been using. Dr. Phillips's testimony was particularly damning. She presented a comprehensive analysis showing how they'd gradually increased the dosages over time, demonstrating a clear intent to cause serious harm. The representative from the pharmaceutical company confirmed that James had stolen the compounds through his college friend who worked in their research department. The defendants displayed a calculated pattern of behavior, the prosecutor argued in her closing statement. This wasn't simply corporate sabotage, but a systematic attempt to harm Mrs. Bennet, with a clear escalation that could have resulted in death. When the verdict was finally read, I didn't feel joy, just relief. Both James and Nina were found guilty on multiple counts, including attempted murder and conspiracy. The judge's words echoed in the silent courtroom. The premeditated nature of these actions, carried out against a family member over an extended period, demands the maximum penalty. I watched as they were led away in handcuffs, thinking about how greed and jealousy had transformed two people I once trusted into something unrecognizable. Their businesses, their reputations, their freedom, all sacrificed in an attempt to destroy me. A year after the trial, I stood at the podium of the Nashville Business Leaders Conference, preparing to give the keynote address. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was exactly the kind of opportunity Nina had tried to prevent me from achieving. The Henderson account, the one she and James had tried so desperately to steal, had led to several other major clients, establishing me as one of the top marketing executives in the region. Success isn't just about talent or hard work, I began, looking out at the sea of faces. It's about integrity. It's about building genuine relationships based on trust. I paused, letting my words sink in. Sometimes the biggest threats to our success come from the people closest to us. But surviving those challenges makes us stronger. After my speech, several young professionals approached me for advice. One woman, her eyes bright with determination, asked how I'd maintained my composure throughout the ordeal. I told her I'd focused on what I could control. I gathered evidence, trusted my instincts, and refused to let fear hold me back from achieving my goals. Later that night, I received an email from the Henderson client, confirming they were renewing their contract for another 3 years. I smiled, thinking about how different things could have been if I hadn't trusted my gut that day at lunch. The local paper had run a small article that morning about Nina and James beginning their prison sentences. I didn't read it. Instead, I focused on the proposal for my new client's project, knowing that the best revenge wasn't getting even, but moving forward and thriving in spite of those who try to hold you back.